Welcome to Yaka Digital Network. Watch someone try to throw a heavy stone, and you will usually see the exact same thing. They tense their bicep and push from the elbow. It is an incredibly common instinct to assume that launching a heavy object a long distance requires massive arm strength. But the human arm is entirely ill-equipped for this job. Isolated shoulder and tricep muscles simply do not have the mass or the leverage to propel a dense weight across a field. If you want to throw far, you have to stop thinking of your arm as an engine. Instead, you have to engineer your entire body into a biological catapult. Mastering this precise mechanical sequence is what separates amateur attempts from the world-class performances you see on the global stage. Elite throwing is a complex physics equation. The arm doesn't generate the power, it merely delivers it. To understand how this works in practice, we can look at a standard secondary school sports field. The physics here are identical to the physics at the Olympics. This coordination is driven by the kinetic chain, a specific sequence of body segments firing in an exact, unchangeable order, starting in the legs, moving to the hips, up through the core, into the arm, and finally exiting through the hand. Think of it as a current of electricity. The energy originates at the point of contact with the ground, traveling up the back leg and surging upward through the torso. Each major joint in this chain acts as a multiplier. The force generated by the legs is added to the rotation of the hips, compounding continuously as it moves upward. If a beginner steps early or bends their posture slightly out of alignment, that sequence breaks. The current dissipates into an energy leak, and the power never reaches the hand. Perfect execution of this sequence is how an athlete reaches their full power potential. So we start at the bedrock. Every explosive movement in athletics begins at the feet. The scientific term for this is ground reaction force. It applies Newton's third law. For every physical action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. When an athlete aggressively drives weight down into the earth pushes back. That upward thrust is the initial fuel. But if the athlete has soft knees or sloppy footwork, the leg absorbs that reciprocal force, and the energy dies. This is why the preparation phase, or wind-up, requires an exceptionally wide, stable base. Maximum ground contact is required to generate maximum force. Look closely at this historic javelin stance. The majority of the athlete's weight is aggressively planted on that back leg. There is zero movement in the arm yet. The focus is entirely on establishing an anchor point. Without that massive reciprocal force generated against the ground, the rest of the kinetic chain has absolutely no fuel to burn. Once the energy travels up from the legs, it enters the midsection. Here, strict linear upward force has to be converted into forward momentum. This conversion happens through torque, a twisting force that causes rotation. The core acts as the true engine of the throw. Elite throwers accomplish this using a biomechanical trick known as the X-factor stretch. This requires deliberately separating the rotation of the hips from the rotation of the shoulders. Viewed from above, the athlete drives their hips forward, keeping their chest rotated back. The intersecting angles create an X shape. Forcing the body in opposite directions creates immense tension in the core muscles, winding them up like an elastic band. A novice will simply push the object outward with their chest. An expert will unleash that stored core rotation to aggressively launch it. That specific separation, the X factor, is the mechanism turning a simple forward step into explosive rotational velocity. We now reach the critical fraction of a second right before the object leaves the hand. This is where the most counterintuitive mechanic in throwing occurs. It is called the block. To generate maximum forward speed, the athlete must suddenly slam on the brakes. Think of a whip. A sudden stop at the handle causes a wave of energy to rapidly accelerate, snapping violently to the tip. The body operates the same way. The front foot plants into the dirt, acting as a rigid wall that instantly halts forward momentum. When the lead side hits that wall, all the kinetic energy accumulated from the ground and the core has nowhere left to go. It rapidly escapes upward, blasting through the shoulder and out into the arm. The fingers are completely passive in this process. They are simply the final point of contact to guide the object on its path. World-class distance is achieved through the sudden, violent deceleration of the body, not the acceleration of the arm. Up until this point, we have focused entirely on the internal mechanics of the athlete. Now we have to look at the external object, the implement itself. Executing a perfect kinetic chain is useless if you launch the object at the wrong trajectory. Maximizing distance means calculating the exact release angle to match the object's unique aerodynamics. This photograph captures a shot put release. The shot is dense, heavy metal. It has absolutely no aerodynamic properties. It is strictly a ballistic projectile. Because it gains no aerodynamic lift, and because the athlete releases it from above ground level, basic physics dictates an ideal release angle of roughly 40 degrees to achieve maximum range. Here we see the discus, which demands an entirely different approach. A discus acts less like a cannonball and more like an airplane wing. The athlete uses high-speed centrifugal force to spin the disc rapidly upon release. Disc spin creates gyroscopic stability, allowing the implement to cut through the air horizontally. The javelin presents a third variable. Throw it too high and it will stall and drop straight down. Throw it too low and it crashes into the dirt. It requires a precise, shallow angle to literally ride the wind currents. This chart maps these flight paths side by side. The contrast is clear. You have the steep parabolic arc of the shot put, the flat plane of the discus, and the shallow glide of the javelin. Every event requires its own specific math. If the athlete miscalculates the aerodynamics of their release, all the rotational power they built up in their core is wasted. There is one final factor that governs the throw, and it has nothing to do with physics. Every throwing event takes place within a strict geographical boundary called the sector. If the implement lands outside this zone, the throw is a failure, no matter how far it traveled. This diagram shows the layout of a throwing field. A V-shaped area extends outward. This is the sector. Hitting this target requires extreme precision. The athlete must maintain control through the violent deceleration to ensure the projectile tracks perfectly between those lines. The sector exists for a reason. These athletes are launching heavy, solid objects at high velocities. They are incredibly dangerous. That demands a rigid safety protocol. No individual walks into the throwing sector until the instructor gives a clear signal that the area is secure. So the process is complete. It begins with base stability. It extracts ground reaction force. It winds up through torque, snaps against the block, and finishes with an aerodynamic release. Ultimately, throwing is the pure expression of biomechanics. It requires turning the entire human body into a unified, intelligent machine. Thanks for learning with Yappa Digital Network.